All right. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be doing this brief seminar on reply speeches. So for many of you who haven't done CP before or the NORAMS format that you're going to be doing this weekend, reply speeches may be quite new to you. And even though they have lots of resemblances with whip speeches, there's some different nuances to consider with respect to the specific format of debating in which they're held, and also the shortened structure and speech time. Couple things that I want to say in terms of overview, but also personally, I love the reply speech. I would actually say that it's my best speech out of all formats and all styles and so on. I quite enjoy it, and I think it gives people an opportunity of redemption and second chances if you do mess up your PM or LO, which I do all the time. So a reply speech is really great to get back in the game and really push the debate a bit further and get other opportunities to engage with tough motions and topics. So in terms of the brief overview of what a reply speech is, in the CP style and the North American style that you'll do at NORAMS, the reply speeches are at the very end of the debate, and there's one from each side. First is the one from opposition, and lastly, to close off the round as a whole, is the reply speech from the Prime Minister. These reply speeches typically last 3 minutes, and they are entirely protected time, and that's really important. So no POIs whatsoever within those usually 3 speeches, and I'll explain why it's usually in a moment. So we'll start with discussing government. So usually you declare at the very beginning of the round, before any speech is given, what style of reply speech you prefer to give, and there's a couple options for both teams in the debate. So if you're on government, you would declare at the beginning whether you want option A, which is to do a standard PMR, Prime Minister reply, or Prime Minister rebuttal. People tend to use the R terms interchangeably here. So what this means is you just do your standard 7-minute PM speech like you would in any other format, and then you do a 3-minute protected reply speech at the very end after op has done their last speeches. The second option that you have, which is why you have to declare what you prefer to do at the beginning of the round, is to do a PMRE or PMR extended. So what that means is that essentially you're shaving off 1 minute of your PM speech, which means that your PM speech is 6 minutes instead of 7, and reallocating that minute to the 4-minute reply instead. So that gives you more of an opportunity to engage at the very end of the round, and it can be used strategically for various purposes. One thing to note about the PMRE, besides the 4-minute length, is that it also changes the parameters of the PM speech itself. So it's not just 6 minutes, it's also 6 minutes with protected time that that only lasts the first 30 seconds and the last 30 seconds, as opposed to the usual minute on each end. And the reason why that is because you're adding a minute of protected time to the 4-minute PMRE, which then means that you would lose some POI time for the other team. So they reformat it such that the POI time remains the same throughout, whether you do PMRE or PMR. Now for opposition, you also have 2 options. The first is called the power speech, or people just call it standard reply speech. And that means essentially the DLO gives their 7-minute usual speech, and then afterwards, they just keep going for an extra 3 minutes, and that extra 3 minutes is supposed to include the components that a traditional reply speech would. That therefore means that protected time for this 10-minute block, it starts at the first minute onwards all the way up to minute 6, and from 6 to 10, it's all protected. So that's just how the format works. Even though this is supposed to be the more standard format, it's actually less used than what we have as the alternative, which is the LO reply speech. So the LO would give a 3-minute LOR immediately after the DLO speech, so that you would break it off into 2 speeches separately. This is what we call split opposition. And you also have to declare it earlier on before the round even begins, so that everybody knows what to expect. Next, a couple of things in terms of general approach that I think apply to reply speeches generally, be it in CP, in NORAM style, GovOp, what have you. Some key things that you need to accomplish, or at least do your best to accomplish. The first would be to identify each team's primary contributions. The PMR and the LOR are very short speeches where you have to do a lot, and that requires significant prioritization and efficiency. So that means essentially don't focus on each and every single response, especially the minute ones that might not be too important for the round as a whole. What you need to focus on is the big picture items, the 2, 3, 4 key arguments and ideas from each side, and we refer to these as contributions. Another thing that you can do, and I will talk about in more depth later on, is to assess the key clashes in the round. Was there a particular question or issue that had a lot of back and forth in the debate? If so, that is probably what you should structure your speech around and focus on most. Another thing, the last two items are very self-evident with any speech, but they're also important given that these are speeches that come towards the end of the round and you want to push out as much content and engagement as you can. So the third would be to attack the opposing side's case. Are there any major glaring issues that you want to reiterate or issues that surfaced in the later speeches of each team? So the DPM or the DLO. Do you want to point those mistakes out? That would be really important to do in the reply speech. And lastly, it would be to rebuild the case. Were there major attacks made against you? Were there tensions pointed out? Was there a lack of clarity on exactly what you meant by your model or your stance or your arguments? If that is the case, I implore you to address these in your reply speeches. So what you'll notice from all of these things, these traits are very similar to a whip speech, but you have to be extremely deliberate in prioritizing the most important stuff and be efficient in presenting it. I'll offer one last piece of general advice here on how to approach the PMRE, the PMR, and the LOR, or even the power speech, though I don't recommend it. My advice is focus on offense. A lot of times teams are really defensive with these speeches. They feel like they have to plug all the holes and so on, and that's legitimate. You have to do so. But it is a speech in which you can really shift the tides of the debate. I've seen this many times. I've done this many times where I bomb my PM, but I'm able to somehow save potentially my side by giving a good PMR or PMRE. And that's really, really important. So focus on offense. The debate is not lost. Those 3 minutes, especially in a contentious round, can be super decisive. Make sure to really push stuff onto the other team and elevate your position as much as possible. Fight till the bitter end. Okay, in terms of structure, the first thing to say is that structure is entirely up to you. There's really no single way to approach this, but you have options. And generally there would be 3 options. The first would be to do themes or key clashes, or people call them questions in the debate. So which side best proves X impact, or which side best addresses the disenfranchisement of people, or what have you, whatever the central contention was, you might focus on those in particular. That's what I typically recommend because it allows for more engagement and clash between both teams within the rebuttal speech, the reply speech as a whole. Another option would be to assess the gov team and the op team. I find it kind of boring, but that's up to you. It's very simple and easy to follow. And lastly, you could do refutation and rebuilding, though again, I don't recommend it for the simple reason that those things tend to be best done in a 7-minute speech with a DPM and a DLO, where in the 3-minute speech, you're really constrained on time and you need to prioritize the things that are likely to stick in the judge's mind. If you focus exclusively on refutation and rebuilding, that probably means that you don't deal with the big picture items and the ways the teams clash, because generally when you do refutation, you focus on the other side, and rebuilding, you focus on yourself, as opposed to the interactions between both teams. So I tend to recommend the first option. But other things that you should include space for, right, besides the themes themselves. First is a discussion of burdens and criteria. Was there something in particular that you needed to prove in order to win the debate? And did you set that out in your own PM or your own LO? That might be really, really important to go back to. Which side proved their burdens more? So for example, this house would ban zoos on government. Did you prove that the threshold of harm generated by zoos is significant enough that you merit an outright ban of them? That would be your burden. So then you would probably want to structure not only your PM speech around that, but also your PMR. Next, you could talk about weighing metrics, right? So what are the ways in which the judge should adjudicate the round? Should it be based on the number of people helped? Should it be based on certain principles that we value more than others? You need to probably talk about those in order to differentiate those two teams, especially when you address themes and key clashes where both teams were engaging in the round. One piece of advice is that if the opposing team offers their own metrics for winning the debate, it might be strategic to try to beat them on their own metric just because you look way smarter for doing so. and you showed yourself to be able to engage not only in the debate, not only in your own terms, but also in the terms that the other side wanted to set for themselves. And then finally, this is really important. You want to respond to the central critiques of your case. Let's say the other side refuted an example you provided. Probably not the thing you need to focus on, because then you could just dismiss that or show that your case applies to more than one example that they may have disproven. What you really want to deal with is central critiques. Did they attack your core mechanism or even the premise of your case, or was there a central impact that you were vying for that they critiqued? You might want to address that. In CP specifically, if you're the prime minister and you're doing your reply speech, I highly recommend that you clarify anything that might have come in the way of critiques for your case itself, the motion that you presented. So if it was tight, or if there were contentions about whether it was unfair to debate or something like that, you probably want to also address those right off the bat in the PMR. Next. Okay. I'll start with, and then actually I think these are the last two slides. So I'll finish with strategies for each side, starting with the opposition because they go first. So a couple pieces of advice that I want to give here. The first is that split op tends to work best. So that means you get a 7-minute DLO, and instead of extending that to 10 minutes, you would have the LO come back in for a 3 minutes speech. I recommend that for a couple of reasons. A, because sometimes it can be difficult to fill a 10-minute speech, or B, it can be difficult to know when you need to transition from your refutation rebuilding and then onto themes directly. C, sometimes the judge actually kind of gets tired of you by minute 6, and then you're extended 4 minutes beyond that. It's really, really difficult. And also D, the LO gets far more time to prepare for this 3-minute speech adequately and efficiently if they also don't have to worry about, as the DLO does, another 7 minutes to prepare as well. So I usually recommend split op. Cases where you would not do split op and do the standard 10-minute power speech might be if one speaker is far more comfortable with the motion, or that they have a better grasp of the issues at hand, or that you both agree that the 10-minute speech would probably be better and the speaker might be stronger. Those would be cases where you would do that. But again, I tend to advise against it. Have faith in your teammates. Usually do the 3-minute speech if you can. And lastly, a couple other things, not lastly, but other things. Opposition has an advantage in this format, in that they have a 10-minute block, be it with a 10-minute speech or a 7 minutes plus 3 minutes LOR. Be aggressive with that. You can really push a lot of pressure because that means the judge only heard your team for 10 entire minutes of speech time. So what can you do in that time in order to be aggressive? You can push burdens onto Gov, show that their motion was inadequate or that they didn't satisfy their own criteria for victory. You can overwhelm them with strong critiques of their case through rebuttal, especially in the DLO, which I think should be a particularly aggressive speech. And in CP format, re-emphasize problems with the motion. The idea here is you want to overwhelm the PM such that in a 3 or 4 minute speech, there's no way that they have time to address all the important concerns that you leverage against them. That's my advice. Be aggressive with that 10-minute block on opposition. And finally, let's talk about government strategies. The first thing is, well, should I do a PMR or a PMRE? Because that affects both speeches, right? Both the PM and the reply. The PMR is great if you feel like you have a ton of content in the PM that you just don't have time to get through, or at the very least don't have the time to get through efficiently and effectively. This has happened to me in some cases where I've prepped a case in CP and I have way too much content, and Noah was gracious enough to tell me that I can't get it done in 6 minutes. I'm not efficient enough. So take the full 7 minutes. That's fine. Now, you can also choose to do the PMRE by contrast if you feel like you can be efficient with your PM speech. And also, if the opposition team is particularly strong, if you know that the reply speech that they're going to give will be really good, or maybe even if the DLO is really, really good and they're the better speaker, and you know that they're going to attack you on several fronts that you're going to have to patch up and that you're probably going to struggle to do in only 3 minutes. In that situation, it might be strategic to do the 4-minute reply. It's up to you, depends on the round, depends on the motion, depends on your opponent. But those are things to keep in mind. Some extraneous advice to that. Address any last minute critiques or any lasting critiques of your case right off the bat. Okay, if there was a problem with the motion itself that you set in a CP debate, make sure to address those right away. Okay, be very quick about it. If there was some case tension that opposition pointed out or a major flaw in your argument, address that first, because whatever else you do afterwards will be tainted by that concern if you did not address it in the very first place. Another thing would be, even more so than the LOR, right? Because you're just going after a 10-minute block of opposition. Even more so than the LOR, you have to be efficient and selective and strategic in prioritizing the important contributions. Don't focus on an argument in your PM if it didn't end up being important to the round, or if another team completely washed it out. Focus on the contributions that are left standing and they're most likely to get you a win. And then lastly, this is the last strategy I'll offer, which also applies to op, but I think especially to Gov, which is to boost your efficiency, use your constructive material to attack the opposition case. This ideally you will have already done if your case was very preemptive from the get-go, even by PM, and that it clashes well with the round and addresses the key themes from the beginning. If that's the case, great. You've already set yourself up for success by the time you get to your PMR or PMRE. But use your constructive material because that gives you an opportunity to simultaneously rebuild it and address the concerns that the other side brought and beat out their arguments however best that you can. Lastly, just win. Yes, if you've seen my presentation on how to op on the spot, you'll realize that this is plagiarism and I didn't cite myself. I apologize. But just win, all right? Do your best, be offensive, fight till the bitter end. And as it turns out, just by going off, sometimes you will be able to pull off a win. But if you don't, have fun with it. This is the last speech. If your round was miserable, it's only 3 minutes, so you can move on from there and then go cry afterwards or whatever you want to do if it didn't go as planned. But anyway, that's all I have to say.